we're going to move on to the next part of the conversation that we're having. That's panel number 2. The questions that have not yet been addressed will be picked up by our panelists in the breakout rooms that we're going to have. So we're now going to be speaking about, panel number 2 is going to be about the transformative education. How can education strengthen the citizenship of rural or developing communities? And the first speaker that we're going to be having, who's going to be speaking to us today, is Sidhya, who founded a school in 2016, the VIT School in Satna in India, and is currently working with teachers, management, support staff, and parents to provide a space for children to grow up, to be empowered adults. Previously, she managed the central government-funded placement-linked skill development program for below poverty line rural youths. So the context is that when you're speaking about education, the mind often goes to the national reforms and global statistics. Today, we would like to start with a single specific story. So the question, what has worked and what has not worked in the VIT school?
Thank you, Atherton, for the question. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the Dreyfus Foundation for the generous scholarship and the full year with WHT, which was very transformative in my journey. So like Atherton mentioned, if we start from the very ground level, which is setting up a school and then working with nearby students who are not actually part of the school, the biggest learning for us has been that it is not really the larger metrics of how much funding is being given for students on teacher training or on educational resources, but it is about how much is being invested in terms of time and training into the entire ecosystem that surrounds the child when they're growing up. And in our experience, while we have been working with children, kids from the ages of 3 to 17, and even beyond in higher education as part of the larger group that works in education in central India, the things that have worked is this ecosystem. The more robust this ecosystem of having parents on board into the child's learning and his future plans, into after school support in terms of activities that the kids want to pursue or the future they want to look into, how can they like explore those things, even in terms of help that they would need in terms of financing or in terms of support for their physical or mental health. And then how much is the job market or how much is the entrepreneurial ecosystem of the place where the student ultimately wants to perform. How is this ecosystem working? And I would just like to take you through one example of this student who studied from, if you can go to the next slide, please. The name of this person is Shubham, and Shubham's father is a clerk in a local court. His mother is a housewife. They were basically landless laborers when his grandfather was working, when he was raising up his kids. And Shubham studied from a very low-cost private school in central India, and everybody expected him to just follow his father and take up the government job that his father would be leaving in some time. But it was because of the community around him that got to know of a good college that would give him a very basic degree, but would give him the exposure, would give him opportunities to understand what he wanted to do in life, which he grabbed onto. And I am very happy to tell you that he went on to secure a very coveted scholarship and went on to do his master's, his undergrad in computer application, but his master's in theater studies. And then he's on to his second master's, not from his state, but from a state in southern India, Andhra Pradesh, from one of the very good universities, the Hyderabad University. And not only this, so where the whole concept of citizenship comes in, because this opportunity was given to Shubham, there were 3 people from the next batch who went on to for the same scholarship next year, his juniors, and there were 2 others who followed him to this double masters that he's doing at Hyderabad. And all of these people have come back. They keep coming back to their town, and they keep doing these workshops based on theater, based on art, with the schools and with the local colleges. So this kind of contribution that that students like these bring us, I mean, the impact is so widespread and it is so sustainable that that's how this belief on in ecosystem has been my biggest learning working on the ground. Thank you.
We're going to move on to our next speaker, and our next speaker is Simon. Simon works at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris as an associate project officer, working on teacher training in support of global citizenship education, GCED. In the last 6 years, he has specifically focused on higher education in Africa. He has experience in designing, managing, monitoring, and evaluating education projects, programs in partnership with universities, schools, and international development agencies. So the context we are going to be talking about is the preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO declares that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. Education is the primary tool for achieving this. And so, Simon, the question for you is, what can big organizations do to improve education in remote and underserved areas?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And happy to see all of you. I see some of my colleagues. My name is Simon, as I've been beautifully introduced. And I work on education at UNESCO headquarters. I was our Louis Dreyfus Weidenfeld Scholar in 2013-2014, doing a master's in African studies. So it's quite a pleasure to meet all these cohorts of Weidenfeld and Louis Dreyfus scholars through the ages and seeing the commonalities. So directly into this particular presentation, I begin by a quote with a great African statesman, and also end with a quote with another African statesman. So Nelson Mandela, former president of South Africa, says it is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, and the son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, and the child of farm workers can become the president of a great nation. And this still moves on. Next slide, please. So this quote simply tells us one of the roles of education. So education, we have to look at it I'll talk about three main areas in which we can look at the education. One of the things that we have to realize for rural communities is that education is a great tool for social mobility. It is one of those tools that will make, as Mandela says, a child of a peasant to become a doctor, or a child of a former slave in Western Kenya to become someone important in Paris. So education is a very good tool for our social mobility. And so it is something that we have to really think about in terms of investment. Then another way to look at it also is to think of education as a human right. So if you see it as a right that is intrinsic, that is inviolable, then you know that we need to really invest and think seriously about education. Because you see, education is not all about schooling. Education is something bigger. And here I'll talk about the pillars of learning. Within UNESCO, we talk about the 4 pillars of learning, and I'll talk about another one towards the end. So the first one is, of course, learning to know, right? So this is about knowledge. It's about the skills that, the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes that you acquire. And then learning to do, the skills that you require to do something. For example, if you're an entrepreneur, what do you need as a skill? If you're a carpenter, what do you need as a skill? Then learning, these two are something that are very important that sometimes we forget when you're talking about education. Learning to be and learning to live together. So learning to be is about promoting holistic personal development of the body, the mind, and the spirit. And while learning to live together, it's about developing social and emotional skills that enable us to live peacefully in an interconnected society. And so this is exactly where I fit in. And within UNESCO also, we have started talking about learning to become, right? Where we start reimagining how knowledge and learning can shape the futures of humanity in the context of increasing complexity, precarity, uncertainty. For example, with COVID-19. And just remembered in May, I had a global webinar regarding the reflections about COVID-19 and education. And a young girl, 14-year-old from Nigeria, there was this debate. It was a webinar. They were talking about going back to normal after COVID, and so the girl said, "We're talking about going back to normal. There are 238 million children out of school, and 10 million of those are from rural Nigeria. And then we are saying that after COVID, we are going back to normal, right?" So it's something that we think about. So next slide, please. It's something that we have to think about. It's not about going back to normal, but it's about addressing these issues. And within UNESCO, we have the Constitution of UNESCO itself talks about building the defenses of peace in the minds of students through education. So that is exactly what the core of global citizenship education is about empowering learners of all ages to assume active roles, both locally and globally, in building more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, secure societies. And it's about also recognition of interdependence and interconnectedness. And of course, COVID-19, I've just said, is one of those ways that has shown us how interconnected we all are. And so I finish with the quote of the other African statesman who summarizes what I've just talked about in the next slide. And this is Kofi Annan. Next slide, please. This is Kofi Annan, who says that when people are able to access education, they can break free of the cycle of poverty and continue building a fairer and more peaceful society. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much. The question is normal. Perhaps we want more than normal. Thank you so much for that, Coach. I will steal that one from you. Thank you so much for the questions that you're asking in the chat. I am excited to see the questions every time they come in. Please continue to engage with us. Tell us what you're thinking about the different things we're talking about. Our last speaker on this panel is Maria. Maria is a research analyst at the World Bank Group's Education Global Practice. She has over 6 years of experience in the design, implementation, and evaluation of education policy at national and international levels. Prior to joining her current role, Maria worked as a researcher for the Research on Improving Systems of Education, the RISE program here at Oxford. She implemented social programs at the Ministry of Production, Ministry of Education, and Development NGOs in Peru. So, Maria, the context is that we all have anecdotes on how the pandemic has affected our education trajectories. Without an understanding of the full scale and nature of this, of the impact of this, which is planetary, and this will have lasting changes, lasting damage. The question for you is, please give us a global picture of the challenges and opportunities ahead. Over to you.
Thank you, Atherton, and it's really nice to see everyone, new faces as well. I wanted to thank the Louis Dreyfus Foundation for inviting me to speak here. And I wanted to say that the degree that I did in 2018 on evidence-based policymaking is being put into practice every day, as I am part of the COVID-19 task force at the World Bank. And I work multisectorally with the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF, implementing the unified response to the pandemic. So I have only 4 minutes. I just want to leave you with 3 main ideas. The first one is the findings of a survey we did in 149 countries. The second one relates to, let's say that the digital divide has been put to the forefront due to remote learning. And the third one is the fact that there is a lot of things that we can do to help vulnerable populations, especially girls, access remote education. So concerning the first one, there is some good news and some bad news. Some good news is the fact that all surveyed countries are implementing in some way some form of remote learning. 90% of them are implementing online and TV, for example. In low-income resources, other modes of technologies have been implemented, such as radio and television, as well as interactive voice messages in complementation to these approaches. Yet, the main concern is the equity and the access to this remote learning, especially in populations such as rural and disabled, and also girls. Next slide, please. So there was a digital gap, a digital divide in the world before COVID. but it has been put to the forefront because of this crisis. And it affects populations in ways more than others. For example, for women, there is a gender gap on digital skills. There has been a study that shows that especially in sub-Saharan Africa, girls have less access to computers and devices, as well as even when they have a computer, they cannot access it in the same way as boys can. In addition, gender norms may explain why girls have unequal access to remote learning as well, because some parents or caretakers may be wary of them using the internet and thinking that they may be doing other things, or they may be afraid of their safety. And in addition, girls tend to take more workload when they are at home, if they have siblings, etc. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give the third idea that I want to give is how can we approach this big challenge of having girls access education in this remote learning scenario. Education technology, it's a good alternative, but we need to remind ourselves that education, it is about interaction between humans, and interaction between students, and interaction between teachers and students, and in this case also parents. So technology is only going to be useful when we engage the ecosystem and when we facilitate these interactions. But I want to give just 4 ideas on how we can use technology in a low cost and low technologic way to reach girls in rural communities. So first, we can keep teachers and parents informed and achieve gender norms. There are a lot of biases that people have, parents, teachers, regarding girls. And there are a lot of interventions, and there is a lot of evidence in Ghana, in Chile, in the US, that tells us that motivational messages, as well as targeted messages to change behavior, can be a good option to implement low-cost and low-tech technologies. Then something very basic, but sometimes it's not in the forefront of policymakers when implementing this, we need to check the content of the remote learning. We need to make sure that the videos that are being used, that the radio messages, that the TV messages are not consolidating stereotypes in either for girls or for boys. Next slide, please. Then we have to monitor the use of remote learning attendance. And this has to be done, well, I spoke briefly before first about a survey that we have done on national responses. And this survey was administered to ministers of education and key informants. But we need to hear from the user, from the person who is receiving the education, the parents and the children. And we need to make sure that they are attending. So phone surveys, high frequency phone surveys, monitoring mechanisms to control for attendance, to remind parents that girls have to attend school as well as boys, are a no-nonsense policy that should be implemented. And finally, we need to use adaptive learning software. So some girls and some boys may feel left behind, may not learn at the same pace as their peers, and therefore they need to be able to use software that goes with their same rhythm of learning and remediate the learning losses that they may be experiencing. Finally, I want to leave you with something. I think that COVID-19, it is an unprecedented crisis, but it offers a gateway to build back better education systems, more resilient education system, and think about why actually education is more important. Thank you.
This has been an exciting panel. So if you look at what we did, we started by doing a top-down in terms of interventions, in terms of the first panel we had. In panel 2, we focused on education, reversed the gaze, and then we started talking about how can individuals transform their lives, communities, and surroundings through education. And the question we have been discussing is how can education strengthen the citizenship of rural or developing communities? And we see that in the questions that are being asked. So the first question, Sidya, is to you. And the question is, what is your opinion on the new education policy of India? Would you say it is progressive?
I would say definitely that it is a step in the direction of becoming progressive, and I'm glad that it has come at this time when education institutions across the country are having this opportunity to reflect back on what they want to do in terms of curriculum and in terms of structuring learning for the kids. So it has come at a good time. There is, of course, a long way to go because a lot of the ecosystem stakeholders are still absent from the education policy, but it is targeting the two crucial ones, which is the students and the teachers themselves. So yes, I would say that it is a step in that direction.
Sidia, thank you so much. And please keep the questions coming in. The ones we were not able to answer in the previous session, we're keeping on to them. So the next question, this is to you, Simon. COVID-19 has triggered the global learning crisis, with children from low-income areas being the most affected. A lot of them are not returning to school after school closures, which makes it much harder or even impossible to help them improve their lives through education. What is the UN approach to addressing this challenge?
Thank you very much, and for this opportunity and for the question. I think it's a sad situation now that out of school children are being added. I mean, they're increasing generally all over the world, especially because of the crisis. And the problem is that where it is actually increasing where there is already precarity. I mean, from rural areas, that's where also the numbers are continuing to drop. And so within the UN, I mean, the UN is big, but I will talk about UNESCO specifically. So there are very many things that UNESCO is doing. The first thing that it does, of course, is monitoring school closures. So that's one of the things that's doing, but also has put together a global coalition. It's called Global Coalition Education that brings all the tech giants and anybody involved in education to provide low-tech, high-tech, and no-tech solutions to ensure that learning never stops. And then, of course, there are webinars that continue and issue notes on key issues on COVID-19, and also provides digital resources and national platforms and supports governments, and has partnerships also with different actors in terms of responses to COVID-19. So there's a lot of work that's happening within UNESCO to ensure that we mitigate the risks and posed by COVID-19.
Simon, thank you so much. So the next question is going to be for the whole panel. So please just feel free to unmute yourself and answer the question. The question is, in terms of the environmental education, do you think that this type of education should be mandatory for public officers and decision makers? If so, what are the challenges of applying this, especially in developing countries?
I work within the target 4.7 of Sustainable Development Goals, and it mostly is concerned with global citizenship education and education for sustainable development. And it is not only education for students, but also is education for adults, because we are talking about lifelong learning. So yes, in terms of approach within Target 4.7, ESD and GCD, Education for Sustainable Development and Global Citizenship Education, there are commonalities, of course, and differences. We always talk about a whole institution approach. So it is not about only students, but it's about everybody. It's about everybody having this type of education. So I support that proposition that public officers should be aware of should actually have this type of education around not only climate change, but be generally about sustainability, about sustainable consumption. And of course, there are challenges of doing that. What we are doing is that we're trying to mainstream this within the education systems of countries. And there are challenges, yes, but of course, there are some countries that are picking up very fast and other countries that are still not going too fast. But of course, it's a good effort that we're seeing.
Maria, what are your thoughts?
I think definitely that this is a very important question, especially because we have to educate everyone, students, teachers, parents, policymakers, government officials on the importance of the environment. We are going through climate change. For example, I'm here in DC, it's not that very cold and it's almost December. We are having shorter winters every year. I think that environmental education is key for everyone, for the whole education ecosystem. So yeah, I would agree with this question from Maria Mercedes.
Sadia, would you have any closing remarks on this question, and then we move on to the next panel?
I think the second question is very relevant, which is that what are the challenges of applying this, especially in developing countries? And I think the thought that I would leave with is that it will have to be very innovative in terms of giving this kind of a training or education to officers who are already on duty. I mean, it could be part of the training once the people are getting into, are going to assume those duties. But for people who are on the front line and who are doing it, it will be a very interesting challenge on how to yes, incorporate it into their day-to-day life, because that is where the actual learning will take place. Not just sitting in a classroom and attending a training that will just wash away in an hour's time, but somehow integrating it into their work. Yeah.